The hum came first, a steady, mechanical heartbeat that wasn't mine. Then a cry split the air, brief and raw, before folding back into quiet. They tell me that was my beginning. Light, movement, a rush of hands. Yet when I try to reach for it, there's nothing, only a sense, not a scene. It's strange how life starts in noise but remembers itself through silence. People assume memory begins with words, but mine began with temperature, the cool slap of air, the weight of a blanket, the scent of antiseptic. I can't recall faces, but my body remembers being held, then released. That's the paradox of birth. So loud, yet destined to fade into stillness. The world announced me with sound, and then my brain erased the recording. Somewhere between the cry and the calm, a decision was made, not by me, but by something ancient within me, to keep the body's truth and discard the story. And that choice, I suspect, is where everything I've forgotten still lives. The photograph sits on my mother's dresser, me in a yellow dress, hair bent by wind, a woman's hand steady on my shoulder. She says it was my second birthday, but I have no trace of it. I study the picture like evidence from someone else's life. The smile is mine, but the memory isn't. It's unsettling how proof can exist without presence. I've tried to summon fragments, the taste of cake, the sound of her laugh, but nothing comes, only the faint pressure of trying. Most adults, I later learned, can't recall anything before age 3. The brain's archivist, still under construction, simply failed to file the early years. So the first chapters vanish, not from neglect, but design. We began as witnesses without language, absorbing everything but understanding nothing. Still, a question lingers like static between the frames. If forgetting is natural, why does it feel like loss? Maybe the brain deletes to survive, but what exactly was it protecting me from? By the time I could form full sentences, my brain had already rewritten my beginning. The hippocampus, the quiet editor behind every remembered moment, was still wiring itself when I was born. It took years before it learned to bind sensations into story. Until then, memories dissolved as quickly as they formed, like ink on wet paper. I've read that between birth and age 5, the brain prunes itself aggressively, trimming excess connections to make room for precision. It's biology's version of editing. Keep the useful, cut the noise. A mind that once absorbed everything soon learned to forget on purpose. That's the cruel contrast. Our earliest years are when we learn the most, yet retain the least. The silence isn't failure, it's efficiency. Sometimes I imagine those lost memories still humming in neural static, untranslatable, but present. What I once mistook for emptiness might just be the mind's first act of order. Forgetting, I realize, isn't absence, it's architecture. And somewhere inside that design, the story I can't recall is still holding its breath. I once believed I remembered my 3rd birthday, the pink frosting, the paper crown, the sound of my father clapping off beat. But when I watched the home video, the truth was quieter. I wasn't the one in the footage at all. My cousin wore the crown. I had borrowed her story so many times it became my own. That's how memory works. It negotiates rather than records. We build recollections from scraps, a photograph, a sentence, the way someone else remembers us. Truth and invention blur until even we can't tell which breath is ours. On my desk, I keep a box of artifacts, VHS tapes labeled in my mother's handwriting, a letter she wrote at 29, a crayon drawing I once claimed to recall making. They're evidence and illusion at once, noise in place of silence. I've learned that the brain values coherence more than accuracy. Still, I wonder, and maybe you should too, what's your earliest memory, and how sure are you it's real? I used to think remembering meant holding on, but maybe it's just the art of arranging what survived. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Nights blurred into search tabs and marginal notes, neuroscience journals open beside old baby books, my laptop glowing in an otherwise dark room. I called it research, but it felt more like excavation. MRI scans showed the hippocampus linking with language networks around age 2.5. Before that, experience existed without narrative, like film without subtitles. I highlighted lines that felt like revelation. Semantic memory forms before episodic memory, meaning before story, silence before speech. I emailed a developmental psychologist who confirmed what the data implied, that memory, as we know it, requires both words and self-awareness, and neither fully exist in infancy, yet myths persist, that hypnosis can recover lost scenes, that forgetting is neglect. The contrast struck me. Quiet research versus noisy folklore. In my notes, I wrote one sentence that steadied me. The brain protects what the mind can't yet hold. Maybe those blank years weren't a theft at all, but strategy, an act of mercy disguised as absence. I closed my laptop, the hum fading into stillness, and let that idea rest inside the silence it described. It started to make sense in a way that felt almost tender. Forgetting wasn't failure, it was design. The brain, still soft and unguarded, couldn't store the storms it survived, so it washed them away like chalk after rain. I pictured those erased moments, not as lost, but absorbed, folded into instinct instead of story. I read studies about cortisol levels in infants, how prolonged stress can mark developing neurons, leaving traces that shape us long after the scenes are gone. That's when the contrast landed hardest. What I thought was damage was actually defense. The brain shields what the self can't yet process, protecting the body from the burden of knowing too soon. A small mercy, disguised as silence. Still, it unsettled me. If forgetting is protection, then every memory we keep might be a story we were finally strong enough to bear. I sat with that idea, the room dim, my reflection ghosting in the screen. For the first time, I didn't resent the quiet in my mind. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was evidence of care I'd never known was there. Understanding didn't erase the consequences. Even when the memories were gone, their fingerprints remained. I started noticing small things, how sudden noise made my chest tighten, how I pulled back when someone's tone shifted. No images, no flashbacks, just reactions wired before memory existed. Research called it implicit memory, patterns of safety and threat written into the body. Studies on attachment confirmed it. Infants who weren't consistently soothed learned to expect disconnection. The brain forgets the moment, yet never unlearns the lesson. That's the cost of protection. What's hidden still governs. I thought of my mother again, her exhaustion, her absence explained by circumstance, not cruelty. She was 22, working double shifts, trying to keep both of us fed. She didn't mean to leave silence behind. She simply didn't have time to fill it. That realization softened something in me, but didn't dissolve the ache. Healing, I learned, moves slower than comprehension. There's no shortcut, no ritual strong enough to rewrite wiring. So I lived with the quiet, tracing its edges, waiting for my nervous system to believe what my mind now knew. I am safe, even without proof. By then, the battle wasn't with my past. It was with the version of me that still thought remembering would fix everything. I sat in my therapist's office, the air humming with the low sound of her clock, and admitted what I hadn't before. I was angry at my own brain, angry that it had decided what to keep and what to destroy. She nodded, quiet but certain, and said, "Maybe it didn't destroy anything. Maybe it stored it differently." The words landed like a key in a locked room. Anger versus acceptance, that was the real divide. My journals, the ones filled with half-sentences and questions, became proof that silence had been a language all along. Every blank space between lines felt deliberate now, not missing. I began to see forgetting as an act of editing, the first boundary my mind ever set. What once felt like betrayal was starting to look like protection's truest form. When I left her office, the city was uncharacteristically still, streetlights trembling in a soft drizzle. For the first time, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt earned. In the weeks that followed, I stopped trying to force memories open. Instead, I learned to build new ones with intention, to replace recall with reconstruction. Morning walks became my quiet rituals. Each step, a line rewritten over what was once erased. I started journaling not about the past, but about patterns, the way my pulse steadied when I paused before reacting, how trust no longer felt like risk but choice. Therapy gave it language, time gave it proof. The contrast was sharp, reconstruction versus redefinition. I didn't need to see the old scenes to understand their architecture. Healing, I realized, isn't about remembering. It's about creating a context strong enough to hold what once couldn't be held. I tell myself, and maybe you should too, what if remembering isn't the goal? What if understanding is? That question softened the edges of everything I thought I'd lost. The silence I once feared had become foundation, not absence. And as I wrote the day's final line, I felt a calm certainty settle in. The past no longer needed to explain me. The hum returned sometimes, low, steady, like the one that filled the hospital room before I knew what sound was. Only now, it doesn't feel empty. It feels like origin. I sit by the window in the early light, the air still enough to hear my own breathing, and think about how everything began in noise and became meaningful through quiet. The contrast has reversed. Where silence once erased me, it now defines me. I don't need the missing scenes to prove I was there. I carry them in how I pause before speaking, how I listen longer than I answer, how I leave room for what can't be said. The past no longer presses for return. It folds itself neatly into the present, like pages closing on the right chapter. I've stopped asking what I forgot. I'm more interested in what I've learned from forgetting. My first memory is silence, and now I know what it meant.